Good evening. My name is Sad Zolkowski. I'm the Deputy Director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, which was founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. As always, I'd like to thank Shelby for her steadfast support of the Biography Center. It's her vision that makes this program possible. Our next event will be Ani Cohen-Sowell, discussing her new book, Picasso the Foreigner, with Blair Asbury Brooks, who is a former Leon Levy dissertation fellow. This event is on March 29th at 6:30 in the Alabash Recital Hall. Please mark your calendars and register for this free event on the Leon Levy website. But tonight we have a special occasion, one co-sponsored by the Institute for Research on the African Diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean. David Waldstreicher's new biography of the 18th century African American poet Phillis Wheatley, which Carrie Greenidge in her New York Times review calls thoroughly researched, beautifully rendered, and cogently argued. Historical biography at its best, literary analysis at its sharpest, and a subversive indictment of current political discourse questioning the relevance of Black life in our country's history. Wow, nice review. This book is on sale, care of Books on Call NYC, and David I know will be happy to inscribe copies after the event. David Waldstreicher has been a distinguished professor of history, American Studies and Africana Studies at the Graduate Center since 2014. He is the author of several previous books on early U.S. politics and culture and has written recently for the Boston Review and The Atlantic. Tonight, David will be in conversation with Elizabeth McHenry, professor and chair of the English department at NYU, who is the author of Forgotten Readers, Recovering the Lost History of African American Literary Societies, and most recently, To Make Negro Literature, Writing, Literary Practice, and African American Authorship. David and Elizabeth will discuss the Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley for about 45 minutes, and then take a few questions from you, the audience. I'll pass around a mic. Please welcome David Waldstreicher and Elizabeth McHenry.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I'll just start out by saying thank you for having both of us, and thanks for welcoming me to CUNY. I'm happy to be here. A short commute from NYU, but very far in the world of my daily life, just because I never get out of, I feel like, my own orbit. So that's another reason why I'm especially glad to be here tonight. And I'm also just super excited to talk about this book, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley. I will admit that this was a perfect opportunity for me. I rarely get to read the most recently published books. And so here I was with an advanced copy of this book. And so I felt like I felt for the last couple weeks like I was just sort of scamming the system because I got to read this book. Not only did I just get to read it, but I also got to read it early. And I can just attest that it's a pretty terrific read. It's a really great book. So I'm especially glad to talk about it. I should just say that I teach, one of the courses I teach almost every fall is a course in 18th and 19th century African American literature. And Phillis Wheatley is not the first author that we address in that course, but she's certainly one of the first authors. In many regards, as I read this book, I felt like I had been cheating my students for probably the last decade by just what a limited perspective on Phillis Wheatley and Wheatley's life and her importance and her context and the reading of her poems, what a limited perspective I had been offering them. So I want to begin by pulling up in your minds, and David, you can help us expand on what I think we, most of us think about when we first think about Phillis Wheatley. I think there are two things. The first is that image that we have of Phillis Wheatley, that oval frontispiece of her first, of her book, of her only published book of poems that we have, that vision of this, of the girl poet. She's sort of looking off into space as if or up a little bit, as if the ideas are sort of coming out of the ether into her head. And she's alone, and in some ways, it is this image of Phillis Wheatley that I think has been perpetuated. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I have to laugh a little bit, the second thing is this trial that she underwent. The trial where she was in Boston, and these 18 men, leaders of the community, got into a room with her. Well, let me just tell you that this book proves both of those images really false. Both of those images from which it seems to me so much of our knowledge, our understanding, what we think of when we think of Phillis Wheatley comes from. And so, David, maybe you can talk a little bit about both of those, that the image itself and then this event that you very firmly in your book say, it never happened. And you can tell us a little bit about, how those 18 men did know Phillis Wheatley.
This is a great place to start, because it's, in many ways, these are the places I started. These are the places usually loudness is not my issue, so I'll trying to keep myself paced evenly and not get too excited at the outset, because I've been looking forward to this day for about 12 years. So this is where I begin, as well as where most readers begin. And that image, which unlike so many images of enslaved people, is closer to self-authored than so many of the images we have of early or 19th century African Americans, because it's her book, and maybe she even had a relationship with Scipio Moorhead, who painted it. But nevertheless, it's a visual cliche that she's deliberately engaging in, and one of the illustrations in the book is a image of Lady Huntington, Selina Hastings, who was the leader of a sect of Methodists and who was bankrolling and promoting converted Africans, who wrote autobiographies, some of the first slave narratives. And she is one of the first subjects of Wheatley's poems, and she has something to do with the promotion of that book. And this image looks almost exactly like an image of Selina Hastings, sort of looking up with a book, inspired by God, mob cap, hand on, and so I have that picture. So it's really, it is an image that says, I'm doing this thing that's really unusual for a woman to do, but I'm not going to be in your face about it, and it's really about God. And it's, don't worry, this isn't going to completely change the world, even though it is going to completely change the world. So I think that the image still does the work that it was intended to do, which was to both excite readers and keep them from being too worried about this revolutionary thing of not just an enslaved person, but an African-born enslaved person having mastered evangelical Christianity, English literature, the classics in translation, and these other idioms which are so obvious in the book by the time you get to the fifth or sixth poem. Now, the trial, which is a tricky matter because it's kind of an honest historical mistake that some folks began to make, in part because of a dramatization that Shirley Graham, in her young adult biography of 1949, I think it is, did this wonderful, first it was a radio play and then it was a young adult biography, kind of a novelization of Wheatley's life, which was based on the best research that was available at the time. And she built a whole chapter and a linchpin of the book around the idea that nobody believed that Phillis had written these poems, and she's just a teenager. And so they call in these ministers, these lawyers, these men of letters to test her, to question her. I don't remember who first called it a trial, literally, but Henry Louis Gates, who was 20 years ago, was already in the process of turning from the most important critic of African American literature, or the best known one, or a very innovative one, into also a historian. He, in various talks and in the introduction to the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, started to refer to this event as the primal scene of African American literature, where from the very beginning, these amazing creative people were under a white gaze and were very limited in what they could do. And in emphasizing that, it became also the primal scene of, to some extent, AFAM lit criticism, to some extent, though there were certainly other scholars were doing other things and reading it differently. And already in 1995, was it Sandra O'Neill was pushing back, or earlier, was it 1985 maybe? But the thing about the trial is that it never happened. It didn't need to happen. These men really, there's a page in the, right after the frontispiece, before the preface that John Wheatley wrote, which was really just a paragraph, that makes it very clear that these men were signing, saying, yes, she wrote these poems. But they didn't need to do that because they had what Gates called an oral exam, and he literally compared it to I can't resist saying here, he compared it to a graduate exam. He compared it to basically or a PhD oral exam, which no doubt he was doing every other day at the time when he thought of that extended metaphor. Because they knew her, she had written poems for them and their wives. She had written poems about their families. They had seen her publications. They all know exactly who she is, their family, friends. They are who they are. They are the cream of the crop in Boston, but they are people who the Wheatleys went around and asked them to sign a piece of paper so that could travel to London and as proof, because it was being published in a place where nobody knew. So it's really to prove in London that they're not just pulling a fast one. But it's really an artifact of book subscription and publication and the transatlantic ambitions that the Wheatleys and Phillis had for her work. And it's not about people in Boston liking to put people on trial, which it has a little bit of this like, oh, here we are at Salem again or something like that. That's not what it was.
I just remember it was always, when I was in graduate school, I think, when this all sort of exploded as a sort of myth. But as David says, it got bigger and bigger and bigger to become sort of, what I think a lot of people still think of and teach as this primal moment and primal scene. People went so far into thinking where this trial occurred that they were like, well, this was, in this certain place in Boston, and it happened on this morning, and I feel like it got bigger and bigger. But one of the things I most appreciate, I think, about the way that you help us to re-see Phillis Wheatley in this book is to the extent to which you portray her as very much a part of not only this relatively small community in Boston, but also a very transatlantic world, a world where there are visits by women to each other, where things travel, including poems, where Phillis was hardly isolated in some sense, right? Where she was very much sort of part of this fabric of this rapidly changing world. And so I guess one of the things I'm so curious about is how you went about sussing out this world. Like, how did you make all these connections between people? How did you trace the comings and goings of ships, of people, of merchants in some sense? It seems as if what you do here is get at the nitty-gritty, the micro-history of this, of what we, I think, always think of as like this big city, Boston. Even at the time, it was one of the bigger colonies. But you make it really intimate, or you've chased it down to an extent that we can see it as intimate. So can you say a little bit about your research, about in some ways, I think that's one part of the question. The other part is, what is it about this particular moment, and by that I think I mean the last decade when you've been working on this book, decade plus, what made it possible for you to paint this particular picture of someone who, quite honestly, in the 30 years before, we've been pretty content to have as a big figure, but not necessarily as a figure that we really knew?
Well, a lot of this, I had a lot of help in several disciplines and fields. There was a lot of great stuff to build on, and including real research in archives, people finding new poems, people finding things about other contemporaries. A lot of this was connecting dots and following leads. That said, the disciplinary divides between early American history, New England studies, African American history, and literary studies, and the history of the book, which is a field that both Elizabeth and I identify with, were keeping us from seeing things and following leads. Most of the folks who had written about, some historians wrote really interesting articles about Wheatley in the 70s. Charles Akers, David Grimstead. These were historians who were, one was a cultural historian of the antebellum period, Grimstead. James Rawley was a historian of the transatlantic slave trade, and he found stuff in the Dartmouth papers that related to Wheatley, and he thought, oh, this is interesting, and he wrote an article called "The World of Phillis Wheatley." Charles Akers was a historian who was writing about ministers and politics in Boston, and he started to notice some references to, oh, like, look, there's a debate going on here about slavery in Boston, and some of these people are connected to Wheatley, and he did what was then a meaty article. It was amazing how back in the day, you could write a 5,000-word thing, and it was a publishable article. Now we expect twice as much, and but then after that, after some new additions and after new poems were found, and I guess maybe after a kind of pedagogical and disciplinary set of changes that meant that there was a lot more teaching of African American literature going on. It was much more literary critics and literary historians who were writing, and they were not looking at original sources on Boston. Some of them were. William H. Robinson did amazing work, and I think he did some of the things I did, but his 80-page introduction to his 1984 Phillis Wheatley and her writings doesn't have any footnotes, so people couldn't follow his leads, but I think he read some of the same newspapers. So I followed a lot of leads. I read in fields I hadn't read before, which took years, including West African history and Greek and Roman classics, both on the history and literary sides, which I had no background in whatsoever. And this, in case I don't get a chance to say again, one of Phillis Wheatley's gifts to me is that I love that stuff now, and I can't wait till I retire to read more of it. So it might chase me out of this place, might want to get back to Horace. And I felt like I needed those fields in particular in order to figure out the beginnings of the story, because of my argument that really she's inspired and using some of these kinds of literature that we don't associate with issues like slavery and the traffic in women and war that are so important for her in her early life and throughout her life, but it's obvious there on the page, and 18th century people knew this, and that becomes a kind of one of the clues, in addition to certain interpretations of Christianity, that provide an opening for her to start to do creative things that eventually lead to her being recognized and being emancipated. But the biggest thing that I did, the thing that really made the book work, was reading every page of every Boston newspaper from 1760 to 1784, and following the leads that I found there. And nobody who was interested in Wheatley, and hardly anybody who was interested in African Americans in the period has done that. And I put it off. I would have finished this book maybe earlier. It might not have been as good, but I would have finished it earlier, but I put it off. I put it off because it was a monumental task and I could only do so much at a time, and it took a long time to do. But I also put it off because reading newspapers is kind of my thing, and I'd done it in 2 of my earlier books. And I thought, well, this is such a different project. In some ways I was making the same mistake. I thought, that's not where you find Phillis Wheatley, and I would just be imposing my method onto her, until I realized that, well, actually, I'm the person who can do this. Nobody else will, and nobody else would be crazy enough to try. So
let me just jump in here, because I was crazy enough to do a newspaper project at one point and read every single issue of every single. You're talking microfilm on a lot of it. Is that accurate?
Luckily, I waited long enough. Now it's all online.
It is all online.
Yes. So So instead of the scrolling, you have to click every page. It's both better and worse.
Yeah. I mean, I just have to underscore the labor of that. I mean, it is literally backbreaking work. However you do it, just the number of hours that goes into that sort of research, and I always found that part of it was the attention, right? Because the point is, if you're going to go through all those newspapers, to really go through all those newspapers. So if you're just going to fall asleep or get glazed over for, half of this page and 3/4 of that page, and I can't even read this page, you might as well stop. But just that level of attention to detail, and that level of focus where you can see the name crop up, or in your case, the boat, the merchant, the closing of a business. I mean, it seems really, I think it's an incredible amount of work that went into this, and just that hands-on work. So I would second the extent to which, you were the scholar to take this on, and the extent to which, in some ways, this book is a labor of, it's a labor of just tremendous scholarship, but it does seem to some extent to be a labor of love. And I'm reminded of just the number of scholars in the last few years who have come out with books about Phillis Wheatley. And when I say about, I mean, one that I'm thinking about is actually a collection of poems that sort of tries to reimagine Phillis Wheatley and, to some extent, like give her an interior life. And another that just came out like a month ago is a book that really thinks about like Black humanity and Black joy and friendship. And one of the chapters reads the kind of joy that Wheatley gets in her correspondence, for instance, with this friend, Abor Tanner. So I wonder, I mean, I think that Phillis Wheatley has emerged as this just super important person, both for African American literature, but also to Black scholars, and specifically to Black women scholars. And in some ways, though their recovery projects, be they creative or critical, scholarly, or emerging of the two or three, which I think all of them are in some sense, they seem so much about the importance of this figure of Phillis Wheatley and like giving her an interior life. So in some ways, your book comes at it differently. But for me, the book is no less about, in some ways, this like deep commitment to Wheatley and to, in your case, to seeing through her, through her as a lens to get at all these other things. So can you talk a little bit about like that approach, or even just as you were writing, what you thought about, what you thought you were getting at? For me, the book is about the American Revolution and this, and what you call, in fact, a civil war. That we can only in retrospect say, oh, well, that was a revolution. But it's about Phillis Wheatley specifically. And it's about this one moment, both in Boston, and it's about the event of publication. So many things, but I wonder how it evolved for you in terms of being a project, and did you ever lose sight of Wheatley in it? And can you speak a little bit about the trajectory of like you're figuring her out?
Oh, I'm afraid I'll go on too long. Let me think. I did a couple of pilot studies. I wrote a couple of essays that I gave as talks and that I published in 2011 and then later in 2017. And I was making the argument that her politics are deeply engaged with the imperial crisis, and that she is relating slavery and the imperial crisis in interesting and challenging ways that tell us something about the relationship between slavery and the American Revolution and anti-slavery in the American Revolution, and that this was a topic that I'd been concerned about and writing about for some time. So so it was always about the American Revolution. It was always about interpreting Wheatley as a more political writer than she had been before. But I'm too interested. I don't know whether it was my sense that actually she was a really good poet if you understand what she's doing and you have the patience for it, or just my own, in terms of labor of love. To me, this is a book about what language can do and what writing can do. And I thought it was extraordinarily important to get it right and to explain why she would say, sometimes by simile a victory is won. And to think about how that could mean something very quotidian, like, I made my point today, I won this conversation, or something like that. Or in a world of war, it could mean, and a world where the battle over the future of slavery and the future of the empire is being fought with words in print. There might be much more going on. And I'm not even, and I, like others have, someone, I'm just waiting, someone's going to say I don't talk enough about religion. I think there's plenty of religion in the book, and I think it's extremely important. But there's been a tendency to reduce Wheatley to her piety, which is just one of her languages and strategies and selves. I mean, I don't want to put it that way because it makes it sound like it's separate from her other selves. It's actually all about how she combines these things. Mm-hmm. She's not, it's actually really interesting the way with Obor, she sounds more Christian when she's writing those letters, but when she's talking, depending on who the audience is, like many truly pious people, like the more you're in a subculture, the more you can kind of turn it, like dial it up or dial it down a little bit. It's a measure of her Christian literacy and identification with it that she actually, some days, some things she's doing, she's more Christian. Some poems, some audiences, she's more Christian than others. And so that thing she's doing with that, she's also doing with imperial politics. She's doing it with her African and feminine identities. She's doing it. She's just incredibly subtle with the way she uses words and the choices she makes. And I wanted to bring that out and to try to, for me, the way to do it was, because we don't have a lot of other letters. We have, and I've uncovered a lot of what I came to think of as footprints where like other people are talking about her. And if I can reconstruct the scene that shapes this moment where somebody's talking about her, it reveals something about what she's doing, not just what they're doing to her, but rather what she is doing and that they are responding to. So I wanted to, but all this needed to set up her poems as actions, because that's where she did her work. That's what she decided that's what her work was. And that's what I think she meant when she said sometimes by simile a victory is won. Sometimes a poem can change a situation. Sometimes a book can make an argument for emancipation on the individual and collective level. And that is what happened. And the politics of the coming of the revolution helped accelerate that, but she was a canny actor in that back and forth that happened where people are responding to her and this is one of the other things is that I argued that she's part of a cohort of young, skilled Africans in Boston. There's been a kind of influx of slaves, of enslaved people after the 7 Years' War, and even though many of them are coming straight off ships, they're young, they're savvy, they may already be cosmopolitan before they get to Boston, and you see in the ads that these people, like in 3 months, they're being described as highly skilled, and like one of my favorite examples is a guy who's a kid who we would call him a kid. He's probably like 13 years old. He's Wheatley's age. He may have come over on the same ship, and the guy who is thinking of selling him has a great genius for a tradesman. Like, we know Phillis Wheatley was a genius. There were others. So what does that mean? It means she wasn't alone. It means she had people to talk to, maybe people who encouraged her. I don't have a lot of evidence to talk about them, but I have enough to say, look, she's part of a community, and a particularly Atlantic waterfront, multiply literate community.
Yeah, so one of the things I was really struck by was the way you portrayed her as someone who was like a strategist, right? That she she was always sort of thinking, and the other way that was so interesting to me was the way that you portrayed the world in which she lived as one where there was this fluidity between preaching, politics, poetry, preaching, politics, poetry. Like in some ways, one turned into another, whether you were a preacher, a politician, or a poet. In some ways, there was also strategy to the way that sermons were put together, the way that they moved into poetry, moved out of poetry, moved into politics. I mean, I thought that was, it was so interesting, and it was so helpful for thinking about literary culture that is not our own, right? That, we separate these things as if they're in different buildings, right? And they literally are in the modern university in different spaces, including religion, which doesn't even really, it has a department, but not really a place. So it was really interesting to, that was one of the things I felt like offered me the most in terms of a way to read and understand Phillis's poetry, and also to see this world where she was not alone. So I thought that was really great. We just kind of wandered into this area. So I want to bring up something that is always has always been through all of the work I've done, one of the greatest, it's not a stumbling block, it's just a fact. And it's something you always have to deal with, I think, when you're doing archival research, when you're working with footprints, traces, little bits of evidence rather than full, complete, rounded stories. And that is speculation. Speculation, right? So I know that, and this was a long time ago when I was, I think, finishing up my first book, was right when Carla Peterson was working on her history of her family called Black Gotham. And she wrote along the way an article called "Subject to Speculation," and it was really about writing history, writing literary history, writing any kind of history, and how you deal with speculation. It's not dissimilar to all the great writing that Saidiya Hartman's been doing on what you do with, for instance, the history of the Atlantic slave trade, where we have so little. Scholars and creative writers have come up with all kinds of different ways to sort of fill in those gaps. But I feel like as historians, we can't go, or can we, into either fiction or critical fabulation, or however you want to call it. But I do think there's this thing, speculation, right, that we still draw on, right? And it allows you, or one might think of it as one of the things that allows you to say, well, you know what? Here are these anonymously published poems that bear the markings of Phillis's work, of Wheatley's writing. And to go, at times in the book, into spaces where it's like, where you ask questions, right? You say, might she have done this, or could she have thought that, or what if this, right? So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's always, for scholars, I'm not sure you ever outgrow the degree of, some degree of discomfort, and also in some ways, like knowing that it's the only way to tell these stories. But I always want to think more critically about, like, what does it mean for, a historian or any of us to sort of, I don't want to say make things up, because we're not making things up. We're making things up based on, like, what we see, what we know, what we can look around, and that's what leads us to speculate. But how does it feel? Like, how do you feel about all this going out into the world? both in terms of how people will read it and in terms of, the work that you did?
All along, even before I started to notice these poems that look like they could have been written by Wheatley in the newspaper, starting in 1773. Long before that, I was very much aware that Wheatley was surrounded by some myths, some of which were created by the only an as-told to biography, well, not an as-told to biography, a short biography written as a preface to an edition of her poems by a descendant of the Wheatleys in the 1830s. And there's been good scholarship that's filled out the picture of Margaretta Odell, who wrote this. And that basically, and if there are other biographers in the room, I think I'm going to see some nods. Anytime you're writing about a famous person, there are myths that biographers have to wade through and make up their mind about, that are based on partial evidence. Like a great example would be, take Abraham Lincoln. There's no shortage of paper, of original sources on Abraham Lincoln. But Michael Burlingame, who's written these, almost 1,500 pages, he had to do 20 years of still evaluating these original sources of these stories that were told while Lincoln was still alive and he was a presidential candidate. Which ones are we going to accept as true and which ones are we going to accept as myth? So that the more, I'm dealing with someone who was practically famous for being famous, right? I mean, it's so much hearsay. And this is one of the reasons why nobody thought they could possibly write a biography of her, because so little was verifiable by original documents. So there was already this issue of, I think there was already this issue of speculation or how to say, how to do the perhaps, maybe, probably, and also I think I quickly became aware, and this was certainly helped out by some of the scholarship that you've mentioned and others going back to say something like Darlene Clark Hine, that when you're writing about black women in American culture, you're writing about people who had good reason to cover their tracks, right? And that in addition to being silenced and left out of the archives, they are erasing themselves to protect themselves all the time. And I started I wanted to think about how Wheatley is, when she's writing poems, she's selectively revealing some things and not revealing others, and that there's been this process of, that there was something about the biography or history that made, that actually the myths had gotten worse, and the trial was just an example of how that you kind of, it was getting hard to separate actual things we could know from just things that have been repeated for a long time. So there's that. So that to me is the background for, but it never occurred to me to even look for anonymous poems until I along the way, I was reading so much about, as I read so much about poetry and how poetry was popular culture, and how important poetry was for women. But the fact is that most women who published poems in the 18th century published them anonymously. So why wouldn't she have done that? When I started to think, okay, well, this is not that unusual, and that actually some of the poems that we do associate with her that were later with strong enough evidence to be said were definitively hers were first published without her name on it or circulated without her name on it. So this kind of idea of of the author who has their name on something versus the anonymous, that it was much messier than that, and that messiness was inextricable from what poetry was and how it circulated between small groups of people and then sometimes larger groups, and that this was her world, and this all made sense to me, and it may have helped. I think that it may have helped that I had I have a couple of generations of experience with unpublished poetry. Mine, my mother's, And then some years, I visited my uncle, my mother's brother, after my mother passed away, and he handed me this box of letters from when my grandparents were young in the 1920s, and they were poems to each other. So I realized, like, so this is normal, and this is going back, and this is like, there's this kind of, this all made sense to me when I started to read more about some of the great stuff that's been done about poetry in the 18th century. Some of it by scholars who used to teach at NYU, actually, right? Dustin Griffin, Ken Silverman, and others. This didn't start to seem so weird and so foreign, because I mean, our sense of 18th century poetry was it's scholarly, it's stilted, it's religious, it's not poetry. It's this weird thing that is before what we consider real poetry, which is when the Romantics started to write it. So, I didn't buy that, because my mother wrote couplets. She wrote in rhymes. I didn't buy that it couldn't be poetry. If it was that, it couldn't be heartfelt and important and circulated in ways that moved people.
It's funny, one of the lines, one of my favorite lines in this is that couplets were the then version of tweets now, which I thought, I actually thought there were a lot of places that you sort of brought it home. Like, you know, you helped us to see the ways that poetry was everyday, the ways that children were so at the center of, you know, like the imperial crisis and what was going on in Boston. And so there were little things that I thought you really were able to sort of bring to life for us. I really have 2 more questions, so I don't know where we are on time, but I'm sure someone will tell us. We're still good? Okay. The first one is about the structure of this book, which is made up of generally short chapters with very, I don't even know what to say. It's like the chapter titles are like just almost, it's like the bell tolls or something like that. They're just very regular, they're very factual, they're one-liners. My favorite of them is The Barbarians. And in that chapter, it's a great chapter. That chapter, in some ways, circles around all the different like discourses of barbarianism, like who was calling who a barbarian. So Phillis Wheatley was called a barbarian, and in her own book, no less. And then she herself, when someone suggested that she essentially become a missionary and go back to Africa, she said, they would think that I was a barbarian, right? If I got to Africa without speaking the language or anything, they would think of me as a barbarian. So it's this chapter that turns itself over and over again to sort of look at these various constituents and how they were all thinking of each other as barbarians and using this word over and over again. So it was like, for me, it was such an incredible chapter. But one of the things that did that chapter specifically was it made me think about all the other chapters, these short sort of bursts that look from different angles at different sets of people and ideas and ways of reading in some sense. And so I was hoping you could say a little more about, like, when you were putting these chapters together, or when you were thinking about either us as readers or you know, the facts of the kind of information you had. All this lends itself to, like, the structure of the book. So can you talk a little bit about the chapters and the way that the book is constructed, for me, it's very onion-like, right? It's like you peel back one layer, you peel back another layer, you go, behind this door, and together it makes this, it brings together this incredible whole, but it does so through these little pieces that then get sort of fitted together, and they are increasingly, they increasingly come together as the book goes on. So I don't know if I just gave away, the brilliant answer or the reader's answer to the question.
No, I'm just glad to hear it. I haven't. I felt that I was in danger of asking a lot of readers. I was introducing a lot of unfamiliar contexts and maybe giving surprising information, some of which would be disturbing. And I also was asking people to read the poems and to read with me. And so I felt that the chapters needed to be short and focused. But I also, when I got past the scene-setting chapters, the one that about her first poem that introduces the book, and then there's one about Africa and the slave trade, and then there's one about her arriving in Boston and the town and the Wheatley family. Once I got past those and I got into where she's starting to write, I wanted to have at least one poem in every chapter to make this point that really the only way for us to understand and see her development was to see it by really chronologically zeroing in on at least one poem. So the nouns, that structure all of the chapters, I started to think of them as not so much scenes as things that she was dealing with, and that I in the introduction I refer to them as words that 18th century people modified, and I meant that in the sense that they are grappling with, dealing with their world, and also that they are describing emancipation, they're describing nations, they're describing barbarians, they're describing preachers, teachers. So it became a way for me to try to make clear the connection between whatever poem it is that we're trying to get to by the end of the chapter and what's going on at that moment. And the book is chronological, is rigorously chronological, and I was. To me, that was like the trick. I wanted to show that we actually can have a biography of Phillis Wheatley that's not just like, oh, in this chapter we're going to talk about religion and we'll kind of jump around and define her religious sensibility and how it is seen in her poems. And in this chapter we'll talk about race, and in this chapter we'll talk about politics, and that there was a way to do it that made her development and the actual political things that are going on at the time clear, and then make the argument about that these things help us understand what she's actually doing in the poems. So that's kind of the strategy around the chapters. They don't really. A few of them get longer toward the end. And it's the moment when they get long is when around when she publishes the book, and around 1772 when the anti-slavery, it's boom, everyone knows that you can't separate the slavery issue. Well, not everyone is admitting it, but a lot of people know, and a lot of people are pressing the fact that it's very hard to separate the imperial controversy from this issue of slavery that people are raising, in part because the patriots are going around saying the British are enslaving us, but also because other people are using that, like Granville Sharp and Wheatley herself are using that opportunity to say, hey, what's the real slavery here? Maybe all the virtue is not on the colonist side. Tories are starting to throw it in, they've been doing it for years, people who are opposing the American protest are throwing it in their face, which is something, a point I have to keep making again and again and again, because I keep having to tell this story again and again and again, because people want the politics of slavery and the American Revolution to be a lot simpler than that. There are Tories and there are patriots and there are pro-slavery people and there are anti-slavery people, and somehow we can line them up. It's a lot messier than that. It's a lot more modern than that. It's a lot where people are kind of playing rhetorical games and making comparisons and doing politics with words, and that's what she's dealing with. So those chapters, like the barbarians one, gets longer. But I have similar fun with what is she doing when she says when she says in the letter to Ober Tanner, and she says about calls the patriots our modern Egyptians.
Yeah.
Like, oh, not only are they Egyptians, which means they're slaveholders, but modern Egyptians. What does it mean? What is that like? Someone who, when there's all this talk about the ancients and the moderns, so.
Yeah, well, it was so interesting because one of the points I think that you do come back to again and again in a way that seems, in fact, to suggest that you don't want us to leave the book with some kind of simplistic understanding of, that the American Revolution equals, an American reckoning with slavery, and then it was all good. That you talk about, like, the backlash, right? That there was actually a backlash to the American Revolution, to that revolutionary moment, right? And that all that rhetoric is flying around about slavery, and yet, the far side of the revolution in some ways was really about a hardening of slavery. And you ask the question, like, was the issue of slavery and bringing people to a newfound consciousness, or was it actually hardening the lines of slavery? So it seems like that point, that idea of the ambiguity, that really, the ambiguity of the moment, and certainly the ambiguity of the world in which Wheatley herself engaged in and really strategized, again, that word, about how to talk about slavery, and how to, in fact, even point out these ironies about, like, what was the kind of rhetoric that was being sort of tossed around, just becomes, I think, for me, it was like one of the richest parts of the book.
I had no idea while I was writing this book that the rest of the world would get more interested both in Phillis Wheatley and in the relationship of slavery to the revolution. I just thought it was something that I had unfinished business with because I happened to be interested in both those topics, and my mentor, the late David Bryan Davis, had written the definitive works about it, and along the way I realized I might have something to add to his monument of scholarship, but it's been, it's one of the reasons it took longer was that I wanted to get that relationship right at a time when it's started to seem like the stakes are getting higher, and that even non-scholars or specialists seem intensely interested in that question and how to think about that ambiguous language about slavery and freedom, and the undeniable fact that some people were able to use the American Revolution and its ideals to get free, but most people were not.
Time for a couple of questions.
Great.
Anyone have a question?
I just wonder if you could talk a little more about the genius of Phillis Wheatley, if one can ever describe where genius comes from, or how it blossoms.
I hope the many dimensions of her genius comes through and maybe people will leave my book thinking that even the white people are more interesting for having recognized her genius. But I think that Wheatley had several kinds of genius. One is a genius in understanding how to read people and make friends and kin and respond to other people's needs in ways that made people want her to succeed and want her to prosper, though there were decided limits to that in the long run. But there is a kind of unimaginable genius where she is able to master what I'll shorthand as multiple discourses in such a short period of time. And so much so that the more I got into it, the more I realized, oh, she's reading that too. Oh, she knows about this. She's reading that. She's reading those newspapers I was talking about, she's reading them. She must have been reading them. She could not have made all these references and made all these connections if she hadn't been reading them. Where is she reading them? When is she reading them? I can't say. I don't know. It's hard to square with our image of an enslaved person in the 18th century, but maybe she didn't sleep. Odell says that they let her keep a candle on and a fire burning at night. Enslaved people, there was some great scholarship about enslaved people and servants and working people in early modern times. They owned the night. And the night was when they're going around changing bedpans and cooking and this is like it's work time, but it's also their time to do things without anybody watching them, right? So she's able to, there are spaces in which she can be creative in multiple ways and set things up to her advantage. So this is all critical fabulation or speculation, but I think that I would emphasize that it's definitely a literary, an intellectual and literary and poetic genius that she had that we know about, but that if she hadn't been such a genius in dealing with people, she wouldn't have been able to make so much of it. And my general approach, which something I might have said earlier, and I've said it to other people before, is I very early on realized, and it was like writing about Franklin, as I did in an earlier book. I'm dealing with someone who's a lot smarter than me, like unimaginably smarter than me. Not only everybody I write about in the 18th century, they know things I don't know. They know their world and I don't. But this is at another level where I have to kind of not project my presumptions onto them, and that is it's the Center for Biography, so I'm tempted to go on about these sort of issues. But that's my take on genius. I became a little bit suspicious of the rhetoric of genius because it can really be infantilizing and its meanings have changed over time, and it's a little bit dangerous because sometimes it can sometimes have a tragic dimension to it, so often attached to it, and I wanted to avoid that. So I only really talk about genius when other people are using the language and dealing with their use of the concept and term.
One more.
Yeah, thank you both for this. And I happened to hear your lecture, I think in 2017, downstairs. You spoke on Wheatley. If you remember, I remember. So I was very glad that you were coming here tonight. And so speaking of Wheatley, the revolution and slavery, was there any, and maybe you addressed this already, were there any poems on the impressions she had of the revolution? And perhaps more importantly, how about her writings about her childhood in Africa and the crossing? Is there anything that's extent from that?
Yeah, there are a few poems in which she talks about being African and about being enslaved and about the process, most notably the poem that's addressed to Lord Dartmouth, but also on being brought from Africa to America, which is an 8-line poem, but is answering that question about how to see that experience. And I argue that the first 4 lines seem to suggest that feels like she's been saved and that this is a wonderful thing, but actually she's really setting you up she's setting up the reader for a condemnation of racists and mocking people who make the very argument that she seems to be affirming in the first 4 lines of the poem. As far as the revolution, she writes a variety of poems that touch on the politics of the imperial controversy, and that's one of the kinds of poems that get her attention and get her a start. She writes a poem on the Boston Massacre. There's some dispute about, that's one of the anonymous ones, but years ago some scholars argued that she wrote it, and I think the evidence is pretty good. So I include that's one of the ones I include among tentatively attributed, as I call them, poems. But really, she's writing about the revolution, about the politics regularly, and into the war years. She writes. I found another one, but she writes several poems to generals, which are praise poems. You know, it's like right out of. You could say it's right out of the Greeks and Romans. You could also say it's right out of Africa. It's a thing that people did, and it's a way of commenting on things that are going on. And I think that it's especially important because of her recognition that this was a way that she could get recognition and be seen as a contributor to the. So she writes to British officers. She's hedging her bets, like all the way up to 1775. She's writing about Americans. She's writing about British officers. Then she ends up, and then during the war, she writes about Washington. And I have a poem to General Gates that I think she wrote. So she's highly engaged in both those things, and they're not separate. You see, actually, they crisscross in these poems she wrote and published in a magazine that are wrote to these British naval officers in Boston, and then one of them writes a poem back, and then she writes, and they say, "Oh, this is so cool that you're." That this beautiful lady from Africa, this wonderful verdant land is writing this poem to us, and this and that. And then she writes it back saying, stop this condescending crap in her reply poem. Like, I'm just as here in Boston and in Britain, and I'm just as British as you are, is what she's saying in the poem. Stop this exotic, like this is charming and you're wonderful and stuff, but you're exoticizing me again. Just stop it, right? It's so great. I love that exchange because it's just you see what she's really doing all the time.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. Come buy a book, everybody.
Thank you so much. The questions were wonderful. I